Thank you for joining this ISG Smart Talk. Our global ISG research and enterprise agility teams will present a new ISG Insights study, Agile and DevOps in 2019. Enterprise culture is key. Our hosts for today's talk are ISG partner, Ola Chowning, and ISG principal analyst, Blair Hanley-Frank. This ISG Smart Talk is being recorded, and the replay will be available to share with your colleagues at the same link as the live event you're listening to now. Feel free to submit a question at any time throughout the presentation by using the Ask a Question box on the left side of your window. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, or if you're listening to a recording of this broadcast, we'll answer your questions in a follow-up email. With that, I will hand things off to Blair to kick off today's ISG Smart Talk.
Thanks, Jillian. So we recently released our new ISG Insights study, Agile and DevOps in 2019. Enterprise culture is key. And the real impetus behind this study are a set of questions that ISG will frequently receive about Agile and DevOps. And these run the gamut, everything from how do we start adopting to what are the best practices for going and scaling these practices across the enterprise. And there are a bunch of really thorny issues baked in here, including how is it possible for companies to scale their processes? What are the right metrics to use and track when you're thinking about implementing Agile and DevOps? Where are teams located? How do they spend their time? And also, very importantly, how do service providers fit into the mix? And so with that in mind, the Insights team went out and surveyed 322 enterprise technology professionals ranging from IT staff and IT managers to software developers and product owners, all to get their perspective on where their organizations are today when it comes to their adoption of Agile and DevOps, as well as where they're going to be going in the future. And so with that, one of the things that I think is really important before we get started is to talk about how we actually went out and defined Agile and DevOps within the survey. I don't know about you, but if you're anything like me, you've probably been in conversations where two or more people are talking about Agile and DevOps and maybe having very passionate arguments about Agile and DevOps, but they're not actually talking about the same thing. And so to make sure that everybody's on the same page, here's how we defined those two terms. First, with Agile, we consider that to be a set of software development practices that prioritize interactions over processes and tools, software that works over comprehensive documentation, collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change using smaller batches of work over following a defined plan, and iteration with consistent customer feedback over infrequent requirements gathering. And for DevOps, the way we think about that is as a set of practices that combine traditionally siloed functions of software development and operations, hence the name, to drive improved outcomes. These practices include aligning with the business, creating continuous feedback loops between all functions, and deploying automation for continuous delivery. And so in the same spirit of definition, I'd like to turn things over to Ola to talk about what we do on the practitioner side when it comes to enterprise agility.
Thanks, Blair. So what is enterprise agility? Well, enterprise agility is about utilizing practices like Agile and DevOps. We would also include practices you may have heard of, such as Lean and productization, to enable our organizations that are responsible for technology in particular to conduct their work at the speed that's needed by the business, with a recognition that not all areas of the business need the same amount of speed or the same amount of agility. So I like to look at a dial and say to myself that high velocity is going to be really important for those technology capabilities that do things like enable digital channels directly to my consumer, or enable differentiated capabilities that my business relies upon to be able to conduct business and achieve the business value that they're seeking. I might see a more of a steady speed and less actual agility or flexibility in areas that are more back office rather than front office, that are relatively mature in how both the business conducts that process as well as solutions that are available in the marketplace. So if you think of it, enterprise agility is about using different practices to be able to use the appropriate gears and lanes to go at the required rate of speed that's needed by the business. And that's really what enterprise agility is. Now, the study specifically spoke to Agile and DevOps as Blair just described them. Enterprise agility is simply the recognition that I don't need all levels of agility and even DevOps everywhere within my organization. So please keep that in mind as you look at how the respondents might have responded to some of the questions, because they, of course, were responding probably from an enterprise view. And with that, I'll turn it over to Blair to begin taking us through the results.
Awesome. Thanks, Ola. So when we looked at the results, one of the first things that we asked of our respondents, who all said that they were comfortable discussing Agile and DevOps as one of their key competencies, is when did their organizations actually get started with implementing those techniques? And what we found is that most organizations that we surveyed ended up adopting both of these practices around a fairly similar block of time that's somewhere between around about 2 years ago and 1 year ago. There are some organizations that are still very new, and there are some organizations that have been doing this for a while. And this is interesting because these techniques are not as new as all of this adoption would seem to suggest. And so people have been talking about both Agile software development and DevOps for a while, but enterprises are really just now getting on the bandwagon and adopting this in a more focused and more intentional way. To a certain extent, we think that this speaks to maturity in terms of the techniques and processes that are highlighted within the market, but it also shows a broader market shift. Essentially, it's not a matter of if companies are going to adopt these practices, but rather when. But it's still worth remembering, of course, that these companies are, in the long arc of history, fairly new in their Agile and DevOps journey, which means that there's still opportunity for them to gain maturity and optimize the Agile and DevOps practices within their organization. And so along that same vein, when we look at what percentage of our sample, or what percentage of projects for companies within our sample are using Agile versus waterfall versus some hybrid of the two, what we found is that today, on average, roughly 42%, our respondents said that roughly 42% of projects are using Agile development methodologies, while roughly 29%, again on average, are using waterfall methodologies. And then 28% are using some combination of the two. And what this ends up showing us is that these processes are fairly difficult to adopt, but it also means that oftentimes, again, as Ola pointed out in her introduction, you have these different processes coexisting within an enterprise. You're not flipping a light switch and getting everybody from a wholly waterfall process to a wholly Agile process overnight. nor do you necessarily need to get there. But what that also means is that enterprises need to be cognizant of that continuing interplay, because an agile mindset and a waterfall mindset will sometimes run into issues interacting with one another and trying to interface between those processes. And so we consider it to be really important to actually manage that interface, because ultimately this transition isn't a technological one. Yes, there are tools that can help. You can start using Git, you can start using Jira, you can use other, project management and code management tools and other technical techniques to help with this transition. But ultimately what we're talking about is helping people transition. And so, Ola, I'd be interested to hear from you, what do you see on the front lines when it comes to this interface between Agile and Waterfall, and how people are managing between the two?
What I find interesting, Blair, is that, you were talking about how the interplay of an Agile project and a Waterfall project has some implications. If you think about it in a larger context, one of the biggest challenges we see in many organizations is, frankly, your financial model and how things like investments are being governed, how investment decisions are being made. And in many organizations, it continues to have sort of a sense of waterfall, right? They want to give you a small amount of money for a very specific outcome in a very waterfall kind of way. So here's money for phase one, here's money for phase two. One of the big challenges that we see is, because we have this very hybridized environment of different methodologies, is what is the right financial model, and how do we adjust our investment and financial models to contemplate more of an agile product-oriented or product management view than we would a typical project phased approach like we see in Waterfall. That's probably the biggest challenge. The other interesting thing about this particular study and this particular view is that if you look at the lighter blue, which is what they're actually doing today versus what they expect to do by 2020, there's not a giant leap suddenly to do a lot more Agile or a lot more decrease in how you're doing Waterfall. What that would tend to suggest is that companies feel relatively comfortable, either that they've got a fairly good mix now, or they're really starting to recognize what Blair mentioned, which is that the transitions are slow. And it does take time to adjust either a portion of your product or a portion of your portfolio over to a different methodology. So I think those are probably the two kind of glaring things: the challenge around how companies actually go about doing this within their financial space, and then the fact that I think people are getting mature about how long it takes to do it.
Gotcha. So to move on now to some of our key findings, these are three of the really key takeaways that we found in this study. 49% of companies agree or strongly agree that Agile is a part of their company's culture. And 52% say that their technology platform supports their business needs. And 59% of companies that self-report they're using a high percentage of Agile methodologies actually say that they can create new products faster. And so that, to me, speaks to one of the really critical pieces of any sort of Agile transition, which is, what's the real business value here? And what we're seeing is that, in general, companies are driving business value by actually creating new products faster through the faster iteration that they're getting out of the Agile software development cycle. One of the other things that we see as really critical is actually obtaining support from executives, getting sponsorship from people within the organization who can help drive that level of intentional change across a wide variety of teams and people, because again, you're going to notice a pattern here. The transition between Agile and DevOps is really about managing the interactions between people within an organization. And so when we asked our study participants for some answers about what they did to make their strategy and their transition a success, as well as what they would do differently, one of the biggest things that jumped out as far as their success is that communication, making sure that teams are really talking with one another, that everybody's on the same page, that they're having good conversations, and that it's well established the way they're going to work, as well as sort of the lines of discussion that are available so that everybody can talk about what's working, what's not working. And by the same token, the third thing on the strategy item, on the strategy success side, I also think is really important, because when you talk about simplifying processes and focusing on that continual improvement, one of the things that's really important when we look at companies within the study that reported high levels of success, what they were really saying is go out there, get out, try these techniques out, and then use that to iterate and continually optimize the way that you work as a company, rather than just viewing this as a single monolithic transition where you go from one state to the next. And on the flip
Blair,
side,
that's an important. I was just going to jump in and say, Blair, that's a really important point, because what we tend to see, and you'll even see it over on the what would you do differently side, right? If you look at the third one there, it says start slow, start small. I think we've seen great success where people have approached this transformation in an agile way, which is minimum viable solution, which means, make sure that it can just work and then continually improve it, continually iterate, continue to get feedback from the teams. It really is very important. But the number one success criteria that we see is the recognition that it's a cultural change, that particularly as technologists and frankly, even our business partners very often are very unused to working together in a consistent day after day kind of manner. And when we look at agility, and particularly when you start to push together development and operations, business engagement in those processes really becomes, think of it as the accelerator that allows, it's not just about a team of IT folks being together and making things work better or more quickly. It's also about bringing the business in so you can have the continual feedback loop and make sure that what you're doing in those really quick sprints is actually doing what the business needs or can consume. So that focus on communications, collaboration, and integration is definitely the number one thing that comes out in the study. And it's also what we see in practice as we see clients being successful at these sorts of transformations.
So to look ahead, one of the other questions that we asked was around what are the top business outcomes that companies hope to achieve by adopting Agile and DevOps? And you saw this a little bit early on in our high-level summary, but what really jumps out from this response is that most of the biggest responses that we got were around increasing production, creating new products faster, simplifying processes, and launching existing products faster, essentially getting to move quickly through the application of Agile and DevOps. And then further on down, you'll see a range of business outcomes. And to a certain degree, one of the ways that we think about this is that companies really find it easy to capture the low-hanging fruit. Increasing production metrics and increasing production capabilities are something that Agile and DevOps are really, really good at doing. And so that's very easy to grasp onto. And then ultimately, what you are going to get is you're still going to get business outcomes from that. Ideally, if you're iterating quickly to get to an improved product for your customers, that should then lead to increased revenue, increased profitability, and better customer satisfaction. But actually getting there is a second order effect that can be harder to see right off the bat. And so then, on the flip side, when we look at what's really blocking people from succeeding with Agile and DevOps, it's, again, some of the stuff that you would expect: legacy technology, security and regulatory concerns, and financial and budget cycles. These are things that are big, codified enterprise processes that can be more waterfall-oriented, that will make it harder for people to actually go out and do Agile and DevOps work. One of the things that I did find interesting is that actually complexity of projects or complexity of products aren't necessarily something that much of our sample viewed as a key blocker to what they were doing, compared to something like the technical debt that we see in that legacy technology response. And one of the things that I wanted to just highlight and point out here as something key, because I think it's possible that enterprises may be missing this a little bit, is not viewing performance incentives and measurements as high profile a blocker. And this is something that can be more subtle within organizations, because this is what people don't do. The way that they maybe don't want to change their behaviors, because the way that promotions work or the way that responsibility is assigned in a postmortem actually disincentivize or incentivize certain types of behavior that may actually inhibit agility. And one of the things that's really important is, as companies look to make this transition, actually going back and reevaluating the way that their measurement and performance metrics, both on a line of business and team level, as well as on an individual level, may be contributing to the outcomes they're getting in their Agile process. And Ola, I'm somewhat curious, looking over the expectations and blockers, how does this square with your experience?
Well, very much so. I think legacy technology is a big bucket. There's a lot of stuff in there because it's not just the technology that we have within our environment that can present a challenge to us. Certainly, a legacy technology, I'll just use an example like a mainframe in my environment, doesn't mean I suddenly can't do Agile or can't do DevOps. I certainly can. But what starts to be a barrier, I think, is, do I have the right architecture to use that legacy technology along with the newer, more modernized technologies? So you really have to get under some of these subjects, the way Blair sort of related performance incentives back to culture change. Legacy technology to me is just a whole lot of things up underneath that, whether it's, look, I don't have the right tools to be able to maybe automate my deployment cycle, or look, I can't change because of the type of technology. Maybe it's a platform technology that I just can't change on a consistent basis or with a lot of velocity. I'm forced into more of a release management style, which really doesn't lend itself to a true Agile view of being able to get consistent feedback. So where legacy technology does impact us, I more find that it's making sure that you have an architecture that contemplates that I'm going to have legacy technology in my environment alongside of the newer technology, and then recognizes that I do have constraints, either within the legacy technology or maybe within the business process that that technology enables. That really gets me back into that mode of thinking that says, I don't need to go as fast. I don't need to be as agile in some of those areas. Maybe they're core systems of record or just business processes that don't change very often. So these are very, these I recognize these. These are what we see with clients, day in and day out. Security and regulatory concerns are always a big concern. We already talked about financial and budget cycles. But I think that legacy technology can be misleading if you think about it purely as a single technology or as technical debt. It really is much broader than that. And it's mainly what we see being the barrier is how do I architect my ability to integrate across my different types of technologies and use different methodologies. So it gets back to that hybridization of the environment, the hybridization of the different types of methodologies, and then finally, the interaction or the integration of those different methodologies along with the integration of the technologies. That has a tendency to be a barrier in our experience.
Gotcha. So one more sort of big general point from the study, when we look at some of these questions around commitment and success with actual Agile adoption and what companies are seeing on the ground, there are some really interesting things that jump out here in this long list of questions. So for reading this chart, one of the things that's important to bear in mind is that these percentages are respondents who agree or strongly agree with the statements listed on the chart. And so when we look at these results, we only get roughly 52%. There are only two questions in which there are a greater than majority of our respondents either agreeing or strongly agreeing. And that's around Agile and DevOps training, as well as having a technology platform that effectively supports business needs. And all of these answers point to different axes of maturity with Agile and DevOps. So things like building relationships with line of business departments, prioritizing reuse of technology, which means that you can drive increased quality as well as increased velocity by reusing the same components that you've already built and you already know work. Integrating Agile into your company's culture. We keep hitting on culture because it's so, so, so important. And then one of the other really key components here is only 45% of our respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they can find the right talent to support the needs of their Agile and DevOps processes. And that's something that when we look forward in terms of where companies are going, that's going to be really, really critical. So, Ola, what are your thoughts here?
Well, I think it's clear if you look just at the top question here about making a strong commitment to training, couple it with the 45% saying that they are having difficulties finding the right talent. I think if you couple those two things together, your statement here is right. Talent is a particularly thorny issue, and there's more to training when it comes to Agile and DevOps and enterprise agility than just technical training. Some of it really is the cultural shift that needs to be made. And that cultural shift rather than being sort of an educational type of training where I need to, go take a webinar or go to a class, are far more about the practice of the right behaviors, the rewarding of the right behaviors. And we talked earlier, or Blair talked earlier, about having the right incentives and performance programs in place. And we even had a question on the Q&A about, how people-related enablers have been used. Those really are critical, because if I don't incentivize accurately for the right behavior that I'm looking for, then I have a tendency to actually, cause the wrong behavior to happen. And when we think about the need in an Agile team, as an example, to have things like a shared accountability model, or valuing the business value that I'm achieving as much or even more than maybe how I'm doing from a metrics perspective, from a pure IT performance perspective, if I'm not aligning people enablers, so things like performance management or even things like rewards and recognition, if I'm not doing those things, I can't enable the right culture. And the culture really has to do with smaller, empowered teams. And trust me, empowerment is a cultural issue. It's not a technical issue. It's not a skill issue. It's a soft issue. It's one of those cultural things that says I need leadership to recognize it accurately and recognize people and teams. As an example, much more than they recognize, reward, or incentivize individuals. So there are things that happen within our performance management, even within our human resource management, and particularly in our behaviors, that don't really get there with training, but there are ways and mechanisms that we can incentivize the right behavior in order to help that. Talent at the end of the day, and this hiring and trying to hire different people, it's a tricky issue. I like to tell the story about going on to a job site, like I think it was monster.com or one of those, and just basically doing a search to say, what is the number one job title that has the most openings within the site. And what came back was a job title that said something along the line of DevOps. But when you opened each of the records and read, the profile of what they were looking for, they were all incredibly different. So we don't even know what to call these generalists or these multi-capable people who now organizations are trying to get into these smaller teams, because these smaller teams need people who can wear multiple hats. They probably still have a specialized area, but they need to be able to jump in and swarm and help on those things as they occur. And in an Agile environment, that's what you want. And that sort of talent is really experience-based. That sort of behavior is cultural-based. And so I think a lot of companies really struggle with, how do I, quote unquote, train my current staff in that new culture and in those new capabilities. And it's far more about the soft behavioral culture things than it is the strong technical skills. And I think some of these answers are sort of getting to that underlying root cause of the fact that talent is tricky, and there's probably an element of culture even embedded in those.
Definitely. To jump off of that really quick, one of the things that I also wanted to point out is that when I look at organizations and see what sort of incentives they have in place, one of the things that it's really important to be sure of is make sure that you're incentivizing the right things and the right behaviors. Because there are definitely times, we've all been there, when incentives are designed to do one thing, but actually end up leading to a completely different set of behaviors. And that's something that's important to keep a lookout for. So to change gears just a little bit, one of the key pieces of feedback and the key questions that we get is not just around where is the market broadly, but also from an enterprise perspective, where are my peers? What are companies in my industry and in my region doing? Not just where is everybody, but where are the people who are like me? And so I wanted to take an opportunity to really deep dive into some of the industry segments that we highlight in the study. And first up, we have banking, financial services, and insurance companies. And these firms are interesting because one of the things that they prioritize way more than anybody else in the study is having the ability to work at different speeds. That's something that they consider to be really important, and I think speaks to some of the unique complexity of the position that they're in, because they actually have to deal with not only keeping a high degree of deliverability and productivity for their existing services, but they're also under increased pressure to create new products that serve their customers' new and emerging needs and keep them competitive in the global financial landscape. And so when you look at all of that put together, it makes sense that it would be really important for them to be able to moderate the difference between a highly agile, very quickly iterated upon product, as well as, making sure that the savings accounts still have all of the money in them. And then when we move on to manufacturing, one of the things that jumped out immediately when we started looking at the data is just how many manufacturing firms that we surveyed said that they have been doing Agile for more than 3 years. This is unlike any other vertical, the percentages that we're seeing here. And when I asked Ola about this, as we were formulating the study results, she pointed out something that should have struck me right off the bat, which is that Agile software development methodologies are often, can be seen at least in part as an outgrowth of lean manufacturing principles. And so it makes a ton of sense for manufacturing companies to have this competency and this practice already built into their existing business processes, because they're doing it to make sure that they're already doing lean manufacturing. And so agile methodologies make a ton of sense. One of the other things that's important here, as well as for our next industry that you'll see, is that Internet of Things applications are going to drive increased needs for agility and increased needs for DevOps, because you're going to need that faster iteration, that more digital mindset in order to take the most advantage of the new products and capabilities that are coming out onto the market and helping to digitize some of these physical business processes. And that's really what we're seeing in the energy, utilities, and chemicals sector, which we sort of all lumped together for the purposes of this report, where they have a significant percentage of respondents that actually said that they got started around about a year ago or less than a year ago with these processes. And what we really see driving that is their focus on, taking advantage of the new digital capabilities that are out there and making sure that it's possible for them to really work with what the new functionality and features that they have available. One of the other things that also stood out is that they're also the most likely out of any vertical that we surveyed to cite security and regulatory concerns as barriers to their Agile process. And so that's something else that we think is really important. Moving on to life sciences and healthcare, these are organizations that are amazingly focused on customer satisfaction. I was really intrigued by this because I wouldn't necessarily think about life sciences and healthcare as organizations that would need to drive that level of customer sat, especially relative to their peers. But what we're seeing now is an increased consumerization of medicine and of life sciences, where the new frontiers in something like the pharmacy sector, you see pharmacies now going and becoming health clinics. And you see new health systems popping up, new entrants into the market that are using technology to try and deliver a more innovative experience, as well as existing enterprises who are working to modernize what they have available to them. Now, to take a shift over to the regional side for just a second, we looked at companies both in the US and in Europe for this research. And what we saw was that companies in the US were much more likely to say that they both have automated key components of their development lifecycle, in this case, build and integration, test, and deployment. They're more likely to say that they've automated more of those processes today, and they're more likely to say that they will have automated more of those processes in 2 years than their counterparts in Europe. And this is really important to keep an eye on, because this level automation for these processes is really key to driving value out of Agile and DevOps, because this is how you drive consistency, repeatability, and velocity. These sorts of automated testing solutions can make sure that you can go faster by ensuring that code works before it's deployed. That way you're not having to roll back deployments. You're not having to worry about spending tons and tons of time manually working through and checking to make sure that the code is ready to go. The automated testing will take care of that for you. Same thing with build and integration. If you don't have to manually kick off a build, that means that it's far easier for code to get into a shippable state. And finally, that continuous deployment, having that infrastructure in place to ship code frequently and consistently is going to help and drive that velocity. Ola, I'd be curious to get your perspective on this automation component. Why, in your experience, what value is automation driving, and why does it matter?
So I think it's driving a lot of the things you talked about, Blair, but I think the thing that gets missed here, or certainly when I talk to folks, what I find they often miss is they think of it purely or try to think of it purely in terms of labor arbitrage. And that's really not what it's about. I may be doing that in some places where it's seen that way. But the reality is that in most cases, when I am looking to automate, I'm looking to automate so that I can increase the quality and so that I have predictability in my flow. So when I have an automated deployment process, it's not just that it speeds things up. It certainly does that. But I think those who are really embracing these practices and automation practices in particular, is the fact that it improves my quality. And not just by a little bit, by a substantial amount, because it's predictable, it does all of the right things. I can't go around the process if the process is automated, because everything I really need that process to do is, of course, included in the automation. And so, as a speculation, perhaps there's more of a viewpoint happening outside of the United States that the focus is on automation as a labor arbitrage move, when we see it in the United States, certainly, and when I speak to clients, it is almost exclusively about speed and quality, and it's not about anything to do with labor arbitrage. There's some of that, I'm sure, in pockets, but the majority of it is really about ensuring that I get that quality as well as that speed of throughput.
And speaking of labor arbitrage, among other things, one of the other key things that we asked about in the study was around enterprises' interface with service providers, as well as their degree of success working with service providers on Agile and DevOps. And things are okay, I guess, in this regard. The couple of really key points that I think are worth bearing in mind, both for enterprises and for the service provider community, is that we see an increasing percentage that prefer to use service providers that match up with their Agile and DevOps practices. And a decent number of enterprises actually say that they get better software development outcomes by working with service providers, which is good news for everybody involved. But on the rough side, less than 40% of our respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with statements saying that service providers are effective at meeting Agile and DevOps needs, as well as that service providers are flexible in delivering services. And this shows that it's actually kind of difficult to fit service providers into Agile and DevOps practice. And this is something that ultimately all of the parties involved are going to have to negotiate, because existing contracts and existing metrics may not be what you need to be the metrics of tomorrow. And that lack of flexibility that's indicated in that last statement is something that I think is really important to bear in mind, because reduced flexibility with service providers means that that can be a real drag on actually making the iterations and changes necessary to keep up with Agile and DevOps processes. Because again, if we go back to those definitions, if we go back to the way that we're thinking about these different ways of working, it's really about driving that iteration, about driving towards tighter, more iterative cycles that will lead to better outcomes through sort of that continued reevaluation of what needs to happen. And if providers aren't flexible, and if enterprises aren't flexible in working with providers, that's ultimately going to be a problem in the long run. So before we wrap up and open things up to questions, I wanted to give Ola a chance to talk a little bit more about enterprise agility and sort of how ISG's enterprise agility practice works and where y'all fit in.
So as we work with multiple clients, and we've worked with hundreds in these subjects, what we've come to determine is that, it's sort of like culture change. It's not as easy as it first appears. It's certainly not simply about a methodology or a process. We tend to think of it as being, a very comprehensive viewpoint that needs to be addressed. So we talked a bit about many of these items on this wheel, but look, understanding your portfolio and your enterprise architecture around it is key. Understanding that you have different delivery models that are required within most technology organizations because the business requires different levels of being addressed either through a speed or a quality perspective, and different value streams of how value is driven through your technologies. That needs to be recognized. Organization, teams, and roles, those are all going to be incredibly important. How we organize into teams is vastly changing the way that many of our roles are structured, how those teams actually interact, and what I do around them is important. Technologies and platforms, of course, we've talked about the legacy technology piece. That's very important to understand. Our partner ecosystem is incredibly important, we find, with most of our clients, in being able to enable more of an agile enterprise viewpoint. And then culture change just can't be, I can't underline that enough. that is probably the one thing that we see in most organizations that is either not recognized as being as big a change as it really is, or, they try to think it's just an OCM thing and I don't even need to address it at all. And then we've talked quite a bit about performance, but the other aspect that really needs to be looked at is governance and just how strong that governance is. We think about regulatory environments, and, IT for many years has been a very control-oriented organization in most companies. And we need that governance to become more flexible. It needs to become more agile as well. And so all of these things are what we look at when we work with clients to establish an agile enterprise within their organizations.
Awesome. So if anybody has a question on the call, feel free to drop it into the Q&A box that you have available. While we're collecting those, I just wanted to highlight the work that we're doing on the Insights team. We are ISG's enterprise research team, and we're working on a whole bunch of really interesting studies that are coming up. We're actually in the middle of writing up our enterprise cloud transformation study right now. And we've got some more great topics coming up: workplace of the future, extending RPA, building a product-aligned organization, Generation 3 sourcing, and finally, smart connected products and ecosystems. So stay tuned for those coming out. And of course, we'll have some more webinars coming up, and you are always welcome to reach out and talk to us about how to become an Insights subscriber. With that, it looks like we have a few questions. Ola, is there one or two that we'd like to tackle?
Absolutely. There were several questions in here kind of that were similar, but I'll read the one that I think is relatable. How many firms have broken departmental silos to empower their teams as an essential way to achieve a sustainable agile ecosystem? It's a great question. We like to say that it's far more important to address your operating model and how you're going to operate than it is your actual organization chart or your organizational structure. But an organizational structure is one of those, human elements, those cultural elements, those cultural drivers that are important to address. So we do see addressing those organization charts. We see most organizations flattening their organizations pretty substantially, but those organization charts also need to begin to have a sense of agility themselves. And so we see matrixed organizations becoming far more prevalent. If you think about how, as an example, a consulting firm works, where you have a people leader, and yet you're put on a team for a period of time, and you have a team leader, and your first affinity is to that team while you're on the team, we see a lot of organizations adopting that. So very good question. That's kind of what we're seeing. How can we eliminate the employee-supplier silos and the consequential behavior that results? Another great question. As Blair was pointing out on some of the study results, look, part of this is a cultural change that needs to happen between how organizations, particularly technology organizations, treat their suppliers and how their suppliers really treat the organizations that they work in. It truly is cultural. And because it's cultural, there are some things that we can do to drive the right behaviors. The number one thing that ISG has seen to be just incredibly powerful, both in business, so the alignment between a business and either an internal or external technology team, as well as between internal and third parties, is what we call a shared accountability model. And what a shared accountability model does is it forces everyone on the team, regardless of what, where they are in an organizational structure or whether they're a part of the company, or they're a contractor or even a third-party managed service provider. It doesn't really matter when everyone on the team is held accountable to the same list of metrics and the same list of requirements and values. And if everyone on the team is judged against those same things, then that has a tendency to really promote and incentivize everyone on the team to act like a team. If I have a different metrics or different value that I'm placing on members of my team, that just because they work for a different company or they're part of a third-party managed service, I actually demote that aspect of a culture of teamwork. And so we see actually a lot of different ways that can be addressed. By the way, for any of you who might work with third parties or even work within a third party, that means that our contracting mechanisms need to support those same things. So if we're putting in place either fee structures or measurement mechanisms in our contracts that are driving the wrong behavior, that can be just as detrimental and certainly undermines any kind of shared accountability model that we have. I think another question about energy utilities, and I think the statement was made, Blair, by you that, they need agility more than others to meet regulatory guidelines. Are there any more details around regulatory barriers? Well, regulations are interesting. I don't just find this, of course, in energy and utilities. You find this in the financial sector as well. One of the issues that we find, or one of the barriers that we find, is actually when you're in a highly regulated environment, you are typically risk averse. And because you're risk averse, your culture, I know I'm kind of harping on that, but your culture is that you take things very slowly and you're not really worried or you're not really interested in a fail fast sort of mentality. And so we don't see it as needing agility more because of regulation. We actually see it slowing it down often. And so that's what we see around those regulatory barriers is it generates a culture of I better be careful. I can't possibly, impact my certifications or whatever it is that's driving my regulation. So that would be a couple of the barriers that we see on the regulatory side. And I think with that, we're about out of time.
Yeah, just to chip in one last thing, what I will say around regulatory barriers is that when you think about compliance in an agile mindset, the key tension there is ensuring that you prevent the sort of old Facebook motto of move fast and break things. To a certain extent, that move fast, fail fast mentality is good, but you want to make sure that move fast and break things doesn't turn into move fast and break something important. And so when you think about making that transition to address those regulatory concerns, it's really about adapting that mindset and the compliance capabilities that you have to build in that compliance to every step of the process rather than bolting it on or building it into a particular step of a waterfall process. So with that, we hope that you enjoyed this webinar. If you would like to get in touch, we have our contact information here. Talia, who is listening on the line, is the right person to talk to if you're interested in hearing more about this study as well as the other great work that we do with ISG Insights. And if you would like to talk enterprise agility, of course, Ola's contact information is here, and as well as the best way to reach out to ISG more broadly. Thanks again for listening. I think, Jillian, I'll throw it back to you to close out the call.
All right, thanks, Blair. This does conclude our time today. Thank you for joining this ISG Smart Talk. As mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be available to share with your colleagues at the same link as the live event. If you'd like to speak with Ola, Blair, or any of our ISG advisors, please reach out to us at www.isg-one.com. Thanks very much for listening.